Session 14. Town Planning Policy in Nigeria. Introduction. In this lecture, we shall discuss the issues relating to town planning policy in Nigeria. To start with, we shall briefly review the history of town planning in the world and the ordinances of town planning. To conclude, we shall examine some issues relating to modern town planning in Nigeria. This will be the major focus of this lecture. Objectives. At the end of this lecture, you should be able to 1. Briefly examine the history of town planning. 2. Discuss the history of town planning in Nigeria. And 3. Discuss the modern town planning as well as issues associated with it. Pretext. 1. Critically discuss the history of town planning. 2. Discuss various ordinances of town planning in Nigeria. 3. Explain the issues involved in modern town planning with specific examples. Town planning refers to the unified development of cities and their environs. For most of its history, town or city planning dealt primarily with the regulation of land use and the physical arrangement of city structures, a guide by architectural, engineering, and land development criteria. In the mid-20th century, the scope of town planning broadened to include the comprehensive guidance of the physical, economic, and social environment of a community. Characteristics of town planning include the following. 1. General plans that summarize the objectives of and restraints on land development. 2. Zoning and subdivision controls that specify permissible land uses, densities, and requirements for streets, utility services, and other improvements. 3. Plans for traffic flow and public transportation. 4. Strategies for economic revitalization of depressed urban and rural areas. 5. Strategies for supportive action to help disadvantaged social groups. And 6. Guidelines for environmental protection and preservation of scarce resources. Town planning is conducted by governments at all levels, local, state, and federal, and by private groups. It is also a subject of university-level study. A brief history of town planning. Archaeological excavations of ancient cities have revealed evidence of some deliberate planning, the arrangement of housing in regular, rectangular patterns, and the prominent location of civic and religious buildings along main thoroughfares. The emphasis of planning broadened during the Greek and Roman eras too. The Greek architect Hippodamus of Miletus planned important Greek settlements such as Priene and Piraeus. Called the father of town planning, he emphasized a geometric design for towns. Religious and civic citadels were oriented so as to give a sense of aesthetic balance. Streets were arranged in a grid pattern, and housing was integrated with cultural, commercial, and defense facilities. Their designs for monumental temples, arches, gymnasiums, and forums are classic examples of town planning based on strict regard for symmetry. Their colonial cities, planned as military camps called castros, were laid out with a grid of streets surrounded by rectangular or square defensive walls. After the fall of the Roman Empire, cities declined in population and importance. From the 5th to the 14th century AD, medieval Europe planned towns around castles, churches, and monasteries, with informal street arrangements. The emulation of Greco-Roman classicism during the Renaissance revived city planning efforts along classical lines. The Piazza of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Piazza of St. Mark's in Venice exemplify an ideal of grandeur in civic structures and public places. In sharp contrast to the narrow, irregular streets of medieval settlements, Renaissance town planned stressed wide, regular, radial, and circumferential streets, that is, streets forming concentric circles around a central point with other streets radiating out from that point like spokes of a wheel. Examples include the street design in the Plan for London 1666 by the English architect Sir Christopher Wren, and the streets of Mannheim and Karlsruhe in Germany. These themes of Renaissance planning were transplanted to the New World in British and Spanish colonial cities settled in the 16th and 17th century. Among them were Savannah, Georgia, Williamsburg, Virginia, Mexico City, and Lima, Peru. City planning in the early United States also reflected the preference for grand public buildings and thoroughfares. A notable example is the 1791 design of the District of Columbia by the French-American engineer Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. His plan featured a network of wide streets converging on major parks, walls, and other open spaces, and on public structures such as the Capitol and the White House. The ideals of public grandeur and radial circumferential streets continued in the 19th century, were exemplified in the Plan for the Reconstruction of Paris, 1850 to 1874, by the French administrator Baron Georges Eugene Haussmann. In the US, extensive public park systems were developed in New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and elsewhere by landscape architects such as the American Frederick Law Olmsted and the Anglo-American Calvert Vaux. During the century of the Industrial Revolution, the few design standards that were introduced often neglected basic physical and aesthetic considerations. This is evident in New York City's Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which divided Manhattan into identical rectangular blocks as a means to encourage further rapid settlement. By the end of the 19th century, the largely unfettered growth of New York and other major cities led to serious overcrowding with a host of attendant problems. The reaction to these conditions became the basis for a new era of city planning. The town planning in the 20th century showed that the US and Britain responded similarly to the need to improve the living conditions in cities. Their initial action was to regulate the sanitary conditions and density of tenement housing. A movement then arose in both countries for a more comprehensive long-term approach, a process of city planning that should examine and control the many forces affecting modern cities. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago featured a planned white city that stood in vivid contrast to the squalor of most urban settlements. In the US, it sparked the City Beautiful movement, which emphasized municipal grandeur embodied in intriguing new public buildings, park systems, and main thoroughfares. Important steps were taken in the early 20th century to formalize and legalize city planning. In the bellwether year 1909, Britain passed a Town Planning Act, which authorized local authorities to prepare schemes controlling new development. In 1909, in the US, the first National Conference on City Planning was conducted. This was the first of a series of annual meetings, which continue even today, that proved influential in obtaining support for city planning. Also in 1909, the American architect Daniel Bonham published his plan of Chicago, a design that was groundbreaking in its regional perspective and comprehensive integration of transportation systems, parks, streets, and other facilities. Town planning received further support during subsequent years. In 1919, Britain made the preparation of planning schemes obligatory for many local governments, and in 1921, Canada enacted a city planning law. Other European countries and Australia also undertook city planning. In the US, during the 1920s, local planning significantly increased. In 1920, approximately 100 cities had municipal planning commissions. By 1930, the number was almost 500. This growth can be accounted for in various ways. In 1928, the U.S. Commerce Department published a Standard City Planning Act that provided communities with a convenient procedural model for their planning efforts. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Euclid and Ambler 1926 removed any lingering doubts about the legality of zoning, a critical end product of city planning. The first zoning ordinance in the U.S. had been enacted by New York City in 1916. Other influences leading to the increased acceptance of city planning were the rapid growth of cities during the 1920s and the ensuing pressures on transportation facilities and public services. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, regional and national governments intervened more forcefully in town planning. To foster economic development in depressed regions, the United Kingdom authorized the appointment of special commissioners with wide-ranging powers. Britain, France, the Netherlands, and other European countries carried out extensive public housing projects. In the US, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, under his New Deal program, established a Public Works Administration to deal with capital improvements, a national planning board to coordinate long-range development, and a program that produced 3 Greenbelt towns. The Tennessee Valley Authority was created to prepare and implement a sweeping regional plan. Federal housing insurance and public became important in city building. The case of Nigeria. Although there has never been any holistic or comprehensive approach to town planning or urban development in Nigeria, town planning or urban land use has been applied in one form or the other for a very long time. Modern town planning policies evolved from the law and other maintenance policies of the colonialists and their concern for the achievement of adequate sanitary and safety conditions. Native authorities were established by the colonialists to manage the affairs of towns and villages within a chieftaincy or emirate. Thus, a local authority was appointed by the governor to govern government reservation areas, commercial and industrial layouts, and new development areas such as settled sections, which were established around existing towns. This was essential because the colonial authorities felt that the management of its affairs was at variance with the principles of indirect rule. The first systematic attempt to provide the necessary legal framework for town planning in Nigeria was provided by two major ordinances: Lord Lugard's Township Ordinance of 1917 and the Nigeria Town and Country Planning Ordinance of 1946. The 1917 Township Ordinance made provisions for the creation, constitution, and administration of all towns and municipalities in Nigeria. In fact, the ordinance ushered in a new era in the management of towns as well as marked a turning point in the growth of towns in Nigeria. This is because, for the first time, a definite law was promulgated to govern the creation and administration of towns in Nigeria. According to Lord Lugard, the ordinance aimed at establishing a broad principle of municipal responsibility and the measure of its ability to accept and discharge satisfactorily independent or quasi-independent powers. The ordinance provided for distinct segregation between European rulers and the Africans they governed. The ordinance also separated matters relating to health and sanitation from those relating to development control and building and street constructions. While the ordinance placed issues concerning health and sanitation under the control of the medical and sanitary departments under the Public Health Ordinance, the enforcement of Township Ordinance was placed under the care of the Administrative and Public Works Departments. The Town and Country Ordinance was enacted by the colonial government in 1946. The ordinance, which was modeled on the United Kingdom's Town and Country Planning Acts of 1932, today provides the legislative basis of all laws governing urban and regional planning in Nigeria. The scope and powers of the ordinance are comprehensive and wide-ranging, to the extent that both the federal and state governments can initiate planning schemes under the provisions of the ordinance. For instance, Section 3 of the ordinance provides that the principal objects of planning schemes are generally to control the development and use of the land involved, to secure proper sanitation, amenity, and convenience, to preserve places of natural beauty or interest, and generally to protect existing urban and rural amenities. Section 13, subsection 1, and parts 4 and 5 of its first schedule add the further objectives of coordinating and facilitating the construction of public utility services, transport, communications, and other public services, as well as of conserving and developing the resources of the areas concerned. The first schedule of the ordinance gives a fairly comprehensive list of subjects concerned primarily with the planning and development of land use and connected facilities. Among these are the following. 1. The reservation of land for roads, the construction, maintenance, and improvement of roads, the establishment of public rights of way. 2. The regulation and control of buildings, slum clearance, the reservation of land for various purposes including open space and for industrial trade, education, and religious purposes. 3. The facilitation of construction and establishment of all kinds of public utility services, transport, and communication. And 4. The preservation of views and specified forms of natural beauty or interest. Apart from these, the ordinance also specifies that planning authorities may prepare and implement planning schemes, enter into contracts for that purpose, and regulate development projects initiated by private individuals so that they conform with the schemes. From all indications, the legislative objectives of the ordinance go beyond physical planning to include the undertaking of improvement works. Because its aims are extensive, the powers potentially wielded by a planning authority can, in theory, permit it to plan, initiate, and carry through development that at one and the same time is physical, social, and economic. Issues in modern town planning. Town planning in the US and other countries broadened in the late 1960s beyond a purely physical orientation. In its modern form, city planning is an ongoing process that concerns not only physical designs but also social, economic, and political policy issues. As the fabric of human organization, a city is a complex weave. On one level, it consists of the arrangement of neighborhoods, industry, and commerce according to aesthetic and functional standards and the provision of public services for them. On another, perhaps more important level, it also comprises the following. First, the background, education, work, and aspirations of its residents. Second, the general functioning of the economic system to which they belong, as well as their positions in the rewards from that system. And third, their ability to make or influence the policy decisions that affect their daily lives. Viewed from this perspective, city planning requires more than a narrow specialist who can develop and implement a physical plan. More general skills and activities are also needed. They include 1. The collection and analysis of data about the city and its population. 2. Research into the need for and availability of social services. 3. The development, evaluation, coordination, and administration of programs and timetables to supply these services. 4. Programs for economic and housing development and redevelopment, not only planning, but also packaging, financing, and carrying out the development. Establishing public and private partnerships, and so forth. And 5. Effective use of political activity and citizen participation to influence the character of and give support to development programs. The Comprehensive Town Planning Policy. The basic town planning document is a comprehensive plan that is adopted and maintained with regular revisions. The plan receives its day-to-day expression in a series of legal documents, zoning ordinances, subdivision regulations, and building and housing codes that establish standards of land use and quality of construction. The comprehensive plan serves many purposes. It brings together the analysis of the social, economic, and physical characteristics, such as the distribution of population, industry, business, open spaces, and publicly built facilities that led to the plan. It examines special problems and opportunities within the city and establishes community development objectives. It coordinates land development with transportation, water supply, schools, and other facilities. It proposes ways to accomplish these coordinated objectives over time. It relates the plan to its impact on public revenues and expenditures. And it proposes regulations, policies, and programs to implement the plan. The comprehensive plan is the guide to making daily development decisions in terms of their long-range consequences. Development controls. Land is allocated and private activities are coordinated with public facilities by means of zoning, ordinances, and subdivision regulations. A zoning ordinance governs how the land may be used and the size, type, and numbers of structures that may be built on the land. All land within a city is divided into districts or zones. In these districts, certain land uses are allowed by right, and general restrictions on building height, bulk, and use are specified. The zoning regulations carry out the land allocations recommended in the comprehensive plan. Specific numbers are given for allowable heights of buildings, coverage of a lot, and density. Allowable land uses are specified for each zone, including special conditions such as required off-street parking. Most regulations are termed matter of right. If the specified requirements are met, a permit will be granted. Other regulations provide general standards with considerable flexibility in the mixture of building uses or the building design. These require more extensive review before approval. Social, economic, and environmental policy. Although the physical appearance and functioning of the city are the traditional focus of town planning, the city's population and economic resources are also an important concern. Thus, contemporary town planning continues to focus on physical design, but also addresses the many long-range social and economic decisions that must be made. A city has social needs and economic capital. The city's government acts as a purchasing agent for many services needed by residents and businesses, for example, education, water supply, police, fire protection, and recreation. The quality, character, and efficiency of these services require planning to fit needs and desires with funding, technological change, and with objectives for physical development. Moreover, town planning should be concerned with providing decent housing and minimal economic aid to residents who cannot afford this basic amenity when local housing is deficient and economic resources permit its upgrading. The City Planning Department may survey housing conditions and coordinate funding to finance its development or rehabilitation. The city's economic development and redevelopment also fall within the scope of town planning. Economic development plans make use of a mixture of incentives, technical assistance, and marketing to create jobs, establish new industry and business, help existing enterprises to flourish, rehabilitate what is salvageable, and redevelop what cannot be saved. Economic development, however, must go beyond the enterprise and the facility to reach the workers. In a rapidly evolving technological environment, with frequent global shifts in trade relations, skilled workers need new skills, and unskilled people need some skills. Job training is a necessary part of development strategy, especially for the city's poor and unemployed citizens. Capital improvement programming is the budgeting tool used by planners to schedule the construction and financing of public works. Capital projects such as road improvements, street lighting, public parking facilities, and purchase of land for open spaces must be sorted out and assigned priorities. A program prepared each year sets the priorities for the next 6 years on projects needed to implement the comprehensive plan and replace the decrepit infrastructure. In rapidly growing regions, city planners are constantly faced with public facilities that have become inadequate for future development. In declining areas, economic redevelopment is of prime importance. Before any capital improvements are scheduled, the condition and viability of the neighborhood must be assessed, and strategies for remedy must be adopted. Some declining neighborhoods require vigorous public development. Others should be left to available private development. The movement for the development of the cities of the late 1970s and early 1980s was insensitive to the cyclical ebbs and flows of city neighborhoods. From the 1980s through the 1990s, it was believed that if an economic function such as business or industry failed, all that was needed was to crop out the decay and clear the land for reuse. In many instances, the redevelopment never appeared. The multiple forces that affect neighborhood changes were ignored or improperly analyzed. Town planners now understand that regional, interregional, national, and international economic forces affect a city. They also realize that the effectiveness of plans to bring about a city's continued economic viability depends on the correct analysis and interpretation of these forces. These are the lessons of the shifts in suburban, non-metropolitan, and interregional economic patterns that took place in the late 1980s and the 1990s. Town planners today are becoming even more involved with their environment to meet objectives for clean air and water, removal of toxic and other wastes, recycling of resources, energy conservation, protection of wetlands, beaches, hillsides, farmlands, forests and floodplains, and preservation of wildlife, natural reserves, and rivers. Historic preservation strives to keep important buildings and places as part of the permanent environment and uses them to finance the maintenance cost. Although town planners may report to local government chairpersons, council officials, or other officials, their true clients are the people and the business of the city. Their plans must reflect the interests and priorities of these groups, and the programs that are being implemented must at the same time help the city survive and maintain the quality of life that these groups desire. Political astuteness is required in order to ensure that neighborhood programs and priorities will be properly perceived by local, state, and federal officials and will stand a chance for implementation. Study session summary. This lecture has discussed the history of planning in the world and that of Nigeria in particular. While discussing town planning in Nigeria, emphasis was paid on the 1970 Township Ordinance as well as the Nigeria Town and Country Planning Ordinance of 1946. The lecture further examined some issues relating to town planning in Nigeria, such as the need for the comprehensive town planning policy, development controls, and socio-economic and environmental policy. And that ends study session 14. Thank you for listening.